Tom Gerencer had thought that he sprained his knee.
Significant injury, the kind of pain that you know is going to take a couple of weeks to go away. But I was thinking about it, and I was like, I don't know what I did. Maybe it's just because I'm in my mid-40s and I'm starting to get old.
But then, mysteriously, the pain moved to his other knee.
Then I thought, what the heck? That's the same. Am I sure about that? Wasn't it the other knee that hurt yesterday, and now it's this knee?
From there, the pain moved to his elbow, then to his wrist.
It was very odd, because it wasn't just like, it was like, oh, I must have done something significant. Like, it's the kind of pain where if you're out mountain biking and you fall down and you hurt yourself, the next day you're like, wow, I feel that.
In 3 or 4 days, this mysterious traveling joint pain went away. Tom forgot all about it. A month goes by and the pain comes back. And it goes on like this, pain appearing, traveling from joint to joint, and then disappearing for several months. Tom knew that something weird was going on. And he also knew that the symptoms he was having seemed like they could be from Lyme disease. He's from Maine, he was living in West Virginia, and he was familiar with Lyme. But it was wintertime, so he wasn't quite sure.
I started getting suspicious right around then that something's going on with me. I don't know what it is, but that's weird.
From there, Tom did telehealth with a specialist. That kicked off 8 months of antibiotics treatment, and then 10 more months of dozens of supplements and antimicrobials. But even with all that, Tom wasn't getting better.
It ended up getting so bad, I would be sitting on the couch and my kids would say, get up and play with us, Daddy. And I'd say, no, I'm just going to sit here. I was irritable. I had crushing insomnia because I couldn't think clearly during the day when it was time to work because I was so exhausted all the time. I'd get these shocking nightmares that would wake me up with a jump in the middle of the night, take me hours to go back to sleep, and then when I would, I'd get another nightmare like that. That started to really affect my life in every way, and it wasn't fun.
And Tom Gerencer isn't just an ordinary guy dealing with a mysterious disease. He's a tech and fitness journalist whose very job it is to wade into confusing, complicated topics and come away with answers. But even he was getting stumped.
There was a lot of frustration and a lot of wondering, how long is this going to go on? Am I going to be stuck with this for the rest of my life?
This set Tom off on years' worth of reporting and research into Lyme disease. This week I'm talking to him about why this very common disease, especially among outdoorsmen and women, goes undiagnosed and untreated so often. And why there are so many conflicting opinions within the medical community about detecting and treating Lyme disease. Tom, before we get too deep into this, what exactly is Lyme disease?
Sure. So most people know it's tied directly to three organisms, 3 animals: deer, mice, and blackleg ticks. And you need all 3 to have Lyme disease. So an adult blackleg tick will lay about 3,000 eggs, which is a crazy amount. They hatch into larvae, which are very tiny, like smaller than a poppy seed. They aren't dangerous to humans because they haven't got Lyme disease. They're just out of the egg. Those latch on to field mice. They latch onto those mice and they feed where they pick up Lyme disease. That's where the Lyme comes from, is those mice. They pick up these spirochetes, which are the bacteria that cause Lyme. If you look at them under a microscope, they call them spirochetes. They're bacteria, but they call them spirochetes because they're twisted like a rotini noodle or a ramen noodle. They're kind of squiggly, and they're very resilient. So, for example, I think because of that spirochete structure, it makes them resilient. So, for example, another spirochete is the one that causes syphilis, which is very hard to get out of your body. Now, on the mice, they grow into nymphs, which are the ones that are the size of a poppy seed or a small sesame seed. And actually, they're shaped like a sesame seed, too, but they're kind of reddish-black. And they drop off the mice, and they feed on deer, and there they become adults, and the cycle continues. Or, somewhere in that cycle, after they drop off the mice, they latch onto a human. That's where the problem starts. Now, there's a big mistake that most people make. They think, well, it's cold out, there's no mosquitoes, there's no moths, there's no spiders, so there's not going to be any ticks. Well, that's incorrect, because ticks are different because they live on those mice. So if the mice are out, the ticks are out. So even if it's cold out, if it's not below 32 degrees, you're going to find ticks. And I've found ticks when it was 32 degrees last night, and it's been 35 degrees for the past 3 hours. I've pulled ticks off myself and my dog, even when it's that cold. So a big mistake, the mistake I made, I got Lyme in February. It was during a short warming spell. I think it was 60 degrees for a week or so, but it had been, every night down below 30. So I thought, well, I'm not in any danger. I wasn't checking myself. I wasn't wearing any kind of repellent. I got a tick on me in February and didn't know it, didn't think to check for it. So once the tick feeds on you, it'll stay on for 48 hours, but it's very small, so a lot of people miss it. If it's in your hair, you're going to miss it. A lot of people miss it anyway, even if it's not in their hair. But it needs to be on you for a long time, at least 24 hours before you're going to get Lyme disease from it, because it's going to regurgitate some of your own blood back into you, along with what it's got from the deer mice. So you have some time, and that's why tick checks are so important. Once you get the Lyme disease, you may or may not get a bullseye rash. You may or may not see the tick. And then what you will notice is when you first start getting Lyme, you'll start to notice a flu-like illness where you'll be kind of wiped out. You'll feel like you have the flu. Within the first month or so, you can cure it with antibiotics. And even for 6 weeks, maybe 2 months. If you get 2 weeks of antibiotics, you can cure it. But once you go beyond that, there's a much higher chance it's going to get into your joints, and there's growing evidence that at that point it gets entrenched in your body and the antibiotics have a hard time reaching it. Not everybody agrees on that, but at the very least there's a higher chance you're going to get what's called chronic Lyme disease, where it's going to stay with you no matter what you do for a long time.
So Lyme disease, what you've described there, is really common. I mean, hunters, outdoorsmen and women are, for the most part, pretty familiar with Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses. And if Lyme is caught right away, it sounds like, for the most part, you can get treated and things will turn out fine. But why do you think so many folks are going untreated or undiagnosed with Lyme and developing these longer-term symptoms?
Well, first of all, you're right that it's very common. The CDC estimates that there's 500,000 cases every year. And I say estimates because they only know about, for sure, about 40 to 45,000 cases a year, because doctors have to fill out a special report, and most of them don't because they're busy. But the CDC says there's probably about 500,000, 450,000 cases of Lyme disease diagnosed every year by doctors. So the reason that it tends to drag on with people is because it's hard to spot. It can masquerade as all kinds of other illnesses, all kinds of other diseases like multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis. At first, you get it and you think, well, I got the flu. And then you start to get the joint pain and you think, well, I must have overworked myself. You don't necessarily connect that 1 week or 2 week flu-like disease you had with the joint pain you're starting to get now. I didn't. And then a lot of people still at that point will go in and say, hey, this is what's happening with me, and the doctor will say, well, we're going to start testing you for MS, or maybe you have fibromyalgia, or maybe you have rheumatoid arthritis, or they even get diagnosed with depression because they're like, oh, I got no energy and I'm achy and all this, and the doctor says, I can't find anything wrong with you, I think you're just depressed. So that's very stressful for a lot of people, obviously. It's just stressful to not know what's going on with you and know that something is wrong, but not know what it is. There's this growing evidence now that it's going to persist with a lot of people by the time you get it deep in your joints and entrenched, and by the time you've gotten past where, it's kind of snuck through the healthcare net because the doctors are kind of fooled by the symptoms. And once it sneaks through for a certain number of months, then you got a chronic case of it that's going to be very hard to get rid of.
On kind of the doctors and the medical testing side of things, it's a little complicated, right? Like there's not a very foolproof or straightforward way to detect Lyme. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, it depends who you talk to about that. Like the CDC's stance is that the tests generally work very well for most people, and probably for all strains of the spirochete that are out there. Most doctors will say that also because they take their cues from the CDC. But most Lyme researchers at places like Columbia University, New Haven University, Tufts, MIT will tell you that's just not true. The people who are kind of on the cutting edge of the research, for example, I spoke with Dr. Eva Sappi of New Haven University's Lyme Research Center, and she said there may be as many as 200 strains of the spirochete out there, and that not all of them will show up on our test.
What the CDC is using is based on one species of Borrelia, the Lyme bacteria, one species. Now, IGeneX, which is one of the other labs, using 2 species, but still not picking up everything. So how many species are there? Some people said 200 species. How many species we don't even pick up with our tests? We don't know.
Now, the CDC's Dr. Nelson, who I also spoke with, said she highly doubts there are that many strains, but the point is that there are lots of different strains out there, and we don't really know. Do they all show up on the tests or not? There's a nonprofit called the Global Lyme Alliance, and they claim that there's a 50% false negative rate in the first test most doctors use for Lyme, which is called the Lyme ELISA test. How do you know, though, that how do you know if there's a 50% false negative rate if you have no way of really testing for sure? And the CDC definitely takes issue with that figure. But what they do acknowledge is that if you do get tested too early, the test will most likely fail because the test doesn't test for the organism, the spirochete. It tests for your body's immune response to it. So if you test within the first 6 weeks after the tick bite, your body might not have that immune response, so you'll test negative. And then a few weeks later, here you are getting sicker, but you're thinking, well, I got tested, it can't be Lyme. So what most doctors and researchers and the CDC agree on is if you think you have Lyme disease and you get tested and it's negative, you should probably wait a few weeks and then get tested again, and then wait a few more weeks and then get tested again, because that way you're giving your body time to mount that immune response for the test to say, oh, now I see the immune response and now I know you have Lyme. But even then, most Lyme researchers will tell you could still get a false negative result. The CDC disagrees. They say generally that's not true, but they don't say 100% that's always not true. And most Lyme researchers will tell you it's fairly frequent that you're still going to get a false negative result.
So we've got these kind of conflicting opinions between, some of the university researchers you've talked to and the CDC, and then through the CDC, kind of doctors on the ground who are treating this. So can you talk a little bit more about how that conflict in opinion is playing out? What does that look like on the ground for people who are trying to figure out what they have, why they're getting sick?
Yeah, there's a huge conflicting opinion out there. In fact, I had a couple of different doctor friends of mine who, when I told them I had chronic Lyme, they laughed and they said, there's no such thing as chronic Lyme, right? And that's an attitude that you're going to get from a lot of doctors. And the CDC will tell you that Lyme disease is cured within 2 weeks of antibiotics in most people. And until recently, they didn't even admit there was such a thing as chronic Lyme disease. And now they say there is, but they say, well, there's no evidence that it's caused by a continued infection. And they say, and many general practitioners say, that chronic Lyme is actually caused by a kind of allergic reaction that, Lyme disease kicks off in your body. It's kind of like a giant long-lasting case of poison ivy. That's my metaphor, not theirs, but that's not limited to the skin. So if you picture it, you rub on a poison ivy plant, the oil gets on your skin, it seeps in to your skin, soaks in, and then for the next, 2 weeks to a month, you might have an allergic reaction, bubbling rash that lasts even long after the oil is gone off your skin. It's similar also, one of the doctors I talked to, Dr. Campos, practitioner who sees a lot of Lyme patients, told me he wonders if it's kind of like what they see with the long haulers from COVID, where, they get the infection, they're over it, but then they're sick, for months and months and months, and maybe for years they're still going to continue to be sick. But it's some kind of an autoimmune thing that starts because you got introduced to this virus.
Both cases, people have this increasing inflammatory response that is out of proportion, and people get very sick. And I wonder if, we are dealing with the same, what we call pathophysiology, the same mechanism of those medical problems.
The CDC and a lot of doctors think that that's what's maybe going on with Lyme is, you get rid of the spirochete, but your body is still having this kind of autoimmune response to it long after it's gone. But that said, there's lots of mounting evidence in studies done in mice and in monkeys and in different tests done on humans that the organism does persist. There's some tests done on mice and monkeys where they say, no, even after antibiotics, we do an autopsy on the mice and monkeys, and we find it in their joints. We find this living spirochetes in their joints. The CDC says, well, you got to be careful. Mice and monkeys aren't humans. Maybe they gave them an injection of too much of the spirochete. The tests done on the humans have found Lyme spirochete DNA in human joint tissue long after antibiotics. Again, the CDC says, well, that's DNA. That's not they haven't found a live organism. But even so, the Lyme researchers and Lyme literate doctors say that when you take antibiotics in a case of entrenched Lyme that's gotten beyond the month or two early stage where you didn't get antibiotics for, it's gotten into your joints, they say you just kind of knock the tail off it and it goes into this like encysted form where it can resist the antibiotics. And they also say that it gets in your joints and it secretes this slippery substance called a biofilm, and it hides in that, and the antibiotics can't penetrate that biofilm. And you knock it down so it's not in your system anymore, not in your blood. You don't feel sick. But then the minute you stop the antibiotics, it comes out of those cysts, it comes out of the biofilms, and it starts to multiply again. The CDC says, well, we don't really know. There's not really enough solid evidence on that yet. But in any case, it does persist. That was how I felt when I was on the antibiotics. My symptoms would generally reduce and be milder, but they were still there. When I got off the antibiotics, they would gradually get worse. So the CDC, though, will caution that, when you say Lyme literate doctor, be careful. That's not a certification. It's a self-anointed term. They also will warn you, be careful if you get treated for chronic Lyme and you don't have it. The long-term antibiotics can really hurt you. There's a disease called C. diff. I can't remember what the long name, Clostridium difficile or something like that. They say difficile because it's difficult to get rid of. But it's when you kill off with antibiotics all the good bacteria in your gut, then this one bacteria called C. diff can grow rampant, out of control, and make you very, very sick. It can be a very, very bad illness, very hard to get rid of. And also, if you do have something else like multiple sclerosis or cancer and you've been misdiagnosed with Lyme disease, you could miss months or even years of life-saving treatment because you're going down, you're barking up the wrong tree. So it's a very tricky subject, and the research is still emerging on it. So that's why it's so unclear.
We'll be right back after the break. Okay, so we're talking about kind of the cutting edge of this research, and there's differing opinions there. But how about on the other end of the spectrum? Lyme disease is really prevalent in the Northeast and in other places, but the disease is also growing its range. So how about in these areas where Lyme disease is relatively new? Is there a knowledge gap there for doctors in the medical community who isn't used to treating Lyme cases?
There definitely is. And so in the past few years, for various articles, I've spoken with 7 or 8 Lyme specialists and researchers about this, and they all agree. Even the CDC, doesn't matter who you talk to, everybody agrees there is a gap. So first, there's a geographical gap because Lyme is spreading, right? It started out mainly around Connecticut and New England, and it's spreading rapidly all over. It's in Michigan, it's in Pennsylvania, it's in West Virginia, and in those new places, many doctors don't yet have a lot of experience with it. They may not have seen a lot of cases, they may not have read up on it as much, so they may not know what to look for. And this was actually told to me by Dr. Christina Nelson of the CDC. So it's generally well accepted that, there are certain areas where they don't know necessarily that they should do multiple tests. They don't know how to treat it as well as they might if they lived in an area where it's been entrenched for a long time. So when I told my specialist in Maine that I was given 2 weeks of antibiotics, just to give you some reference, he said he didn't know any doctor in Maine who would do less than a month. He was like, wow, I wouldn't ever expect that. That's because basically the doctor in West Virginia was reading the CDC's material and saying, okay, 2 weeks of antibiotics, that'll do it. Second, there's just a general gap. There's a big difference in what the CDC will tell you about Lyme and what the cutting-edge Lyme researchers will tell you and what different doctors will tell you. Even if you live in Connecticut, you might go to one doctor who says, oh, no, we got to give you a month of antibiotics. You might go to another doctor who says, no, you're going to be fine, and after this, antibiotics, you're going to be cured, and there's no such thing as chronic Lyme. It just depends who you talk to. Our knowledge of it is still emerging, so it's just not understood yet, like many other diseases are.
Tom, I have a 6-year-old black lab. She's my duck hunting dog, and she is vaccinated for Lyme. A lot of people who have hunting dogs and, just pet dogs, their dogs are probably vaccinated for Lyme. Why don't we have a Lyme vaccination for people?
We did, but it got sued out of existence. So I spoke with the researcher from Tufts University, Dr. Sam Telford, who led the team that created the Lyme disease vaccine for humans in the 1990s. It was actually launched to the market in 1998. He's very frustrated about this. If you talk to him, you can hear it in his voice. Because the vaccine was tested by the company that's now known as GlaxoSmithKline in 3-phase clinical trials, and it was approved for use for the general public in 1998 by the FDA. So we should have a vaccine. We did have a vaccine, but after a couple of years on the market, there was a class action suit by a lot of people who got the vaccine and said it made them sick. And the suit failed, and the CDC said there was no medical evidence behind it, and the courts found that that was correct. There was no evidence that said that this vaccine was making people sick. But the company got cold feet anyway because it's a pharmaceutical company. They're trying to make money. Lawsuits are expensive. In effect, the company said, look, not very many people care about Lyme. They're not afraid of it until after they've already got it. It's not going to be very profitable to begin with. And we're going to have to keep fighting lawsuits like this. So it's going to cost us more than it's worth. So they pulled it off the shelf. And another company took that vaccine and basically uses the same vaccine in dogs like your black lab, and that's the vaccine that your dog almost certainly got, is the same one that this guy, Dr. Sam Telford of Tufts University, developed. And nobody complains that that is making their dog sick. But it's interesting that a lot of the people in the lawsuit weren't saying that the vaccine gave them Lyme. A lot of them were saying it gave them arthritis. So that's kind of curious, because if the CDC is right that Lyme is really like a giant case of poison ivy or an allergic reaction instead, that I personally think it's possible that the vaccine did cause that. But so maybe it's, you got the vaccine and then that kicked off this allergic reaction. Maybe that's true, but that's just speculation. I also personally believe that what's really true is that chronic Lyme does have a continued infection behind it, and that maybe there's an autoimmune component to it, but that it's really a long-term infection. But having said that, it's very frustrating that vaccine got pulled. There's another one on the horizon, but it's probably going to be several years before we see that.
Okay, so no vaccine, at least for now. Kind of complications and conflicting opinions on the tests. So what should outdoorsmen and women do if they're having some of these symptoms that you're talking about and they suspect that they might have Lyme, but they're not being treated for it by their doctor?
So you can always find another doctor. You can get a second opinion. You can get tested for Lyme, certainly, not just once, but 3 or even 4 times, waiting 3 or 4 weeks in between each test. You can look for traveling joint pain. If you never saw a rash, you never saw a tick, but you can have lots of other symptoms that can look like other diseases, but that joint pain, that's severe, like feels like you sprained your finger or your wrist or your ankle and then it goes away in a day or two and shows up somewhere else in your body, that traveling severe joint pain is a telltale symptom that is very unique to Lyme disease. There's not a lot of other diseases that are going to do that to you. According to my Lyme specialist, no other diseases that are going to do that to you. So if you have traveling joint pain, you probably have Lyme. So if you have that, you're not getting a positive test result, you might consider going to a Lyme literate doctor. As like I said, it's a self-anointed term, but they will use, there's a different test they'll use called the IGeneX test, which is a little more lenient, which will get less false negatives. So that's something you do, is go to a Lyme literate doctor, get that test, get multiple tests. But do be careful, because the treatments can be expensive. If you don't get diagnosed for Lyme disease and they're treating you anyway, if you don't have that positive test result, it's not going to be covered by your insurance. And like the CDC says, those long-term antibiotics can be dangerous. On the flip side of that, though, my Lyme specialist was very careful to put me on probiotics. He encouraged me to make my own sauerkraut with live cultures in it, to get lots and lots of those probiotics into my system to fight the side effects of the antibiotics. But I just generally just be careful, proceed with caution.
Okay, so Tom, how are you doing now? And what treatments, if any, worked?
So I am 100% better now. I won't say cured, but I haven't had any symptoms in a year and a half. And it's funny, you know, after the 8 months of antibiotics, after 10 months of all kinds of other supplements and medicines, my symptoms were continuing to get worse and worse. And I was thinking, well, am I just going to be paying all this money and all these medicines? And if I go off them, I'm going to have to deal with getting really sick. Like, this is horrible. The medicines were making me sick as well. So at this time, after about 18 months of treatment, a friend just out of the blue said, hey, I've been doing this intermittent fasting, and I used to have this joint pain, and it's totally gone away. He didn't know I had Lyme. So I was like, whoa, hey, I'm going to try that. I'll try anything once. So I tried it, and all it was skipping breakfast and then eating more for lunch and dinner. So I wasn't eating any less than usual. It was just the timing of my meals. I was just not eating until like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And after about 4 days of that, all my pain went away. And I didn't know if that was a coincidence or what. So I messaged my Lyme specialist and said, here's what's going on. And he said, well, let's have our regular checkup at the end of the month. And I said, okay. And after a month, still no symptoms. And my specialist said, I think we're done. I think, you know, unless your symptoms start coming back, just keep doing what you're doing. By then, I had also started skipping lunch, believe it or not, because it was working, but every once in a while I'd start to get a little symptoms. So I thought, well, it's working. It's obviously working. So I'm going to go at one better. And actually, I wouldn't eat until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then I would just be like Thanksgiving dinner. And I still do that to this day. I generally don't eat until 4:30 or 5 o'clock at night. I haven't eaten anything yet today. Here it is, 11 o'clock in the morning, and I'm not going to eat anything until about 5 p.m. But that was 18 months ago when I started that. I haven't had any symptoms at all, unless if we're over a friend's house for a birthday party, I have some cake and ice cream. The next day I'll have some joint pain. So I know, you know, I've tried going back off it. I've thought, well, maybe I got rid of it altogether now and I'll go back to being a normal person again. And nope, the symptoms will come right back. So, but I don't generally do that I don't try eating sugar or eating breakfast for longer than like a few days because it's so obvious that it comes back. But most of the time, I'm 100% free of symptoms. And I know that as long as I continue the intermittent fasting, I'm 100% always free of symptoms. After this started working for me, I started researching, is there any evidence on it? And I found actually a couple of small studies that aren't big enough to really say it's conclusive, but that said that intermittent fasting does help with Lyme symptoms and that also the ketogenic diet does. So there is a ton of evidence that intermittent fasting fights inflammation. And so if chronic Lyme really is just an autoimmune disease, all those are based in inflammation, then maybe that's why it's working. Almost every one of the researchers and doctors I've talked to have said, you know, it makes sense that intermittent fasting would fight Lyme disease because it is an inflammation-based disease. And one of them actually, Dr. Shannon Delaney of Columbia University, said they're going to be starting up some new studies to try different treatments for Lyme. And she said, we're going to try intermittent fasting and keto now that you say that it helped you. So I'll be really interested to see how that works out.
Sort of mainstream medical establishment kind of approach to diagnosis and treatment, which is like in many ways flawed. And, you know, the tests are very insensitive. But there's also just the biology of things in the sense that like this bacteria is a really complicated one and can really wreak havoc on the body. And it can invade, you know, it's a multi-system, in its chronic phases, it's a multi-system illness.
If there's one takeaway that I have from hearing all of this research and reporting, it's that you really don't want to get Lyme if you can avoid it. But, you know, outdoorsmen and women, we're outside all the time, you know, in the spring, turkey hunting, fishing, you know, we're going to run into ticks. We're going to have ticks around us. So what can we do to prevent these tick-borne illnesses?
Well, first of all, sadly, it's way worse than it was when we were kids. When I was a kid, I was outdoors all the time. I never worried about ticks. because they weren't there. Why? Because hunters were keeping the deer populations in check. Basically, people have hunted deer up until now to the point where the deer populations were at a reasonable level. Right now, I spoke with Dr. David Stainbrook. He's a biologist for the state of Massachusetts, and he said, look, deer populations are out of control, and they're out of control in the past 30 years. And you can trace it straight line back to hunting restrictions on public lands and hunting restrictions around towns. So you're going to have a lot more of it now to deal with than we have in years past. But so because you have more of it, you need to stay vigilant. You can wear insect repellent. It certainly works. DEET works great. If you don't like DEET, which I don't because it's a heavy chemical, you can use natural insect repellents. They work, but they're very volatile. They evaporate quickly. They don't last. So you need to keep reapplying them about once an hour. Permethrin is a heavy chemical, but you don't spray it directly on your skin. You can get some permethrin clothing treatment. You can spray it onto your clothes. It lasts 6 weeks or 6 washes. So I spray it onto my outdoor gear. I use a respirator because I don't want to breathe it in because it's nasty. But you can buy pre-treated clothes for you and your dogs as well. Putting a tick shirt on a dog is great because the tick will get into your house on a dog, right? And if it doesn't bite the dog, it can fall off the dog, and the dog's up on the couch with you. It's up on the bed. It can bite you. It's a big way that people often get bit is by the dog coming in and bringing the tick in with them. But the pre-treated clothing is expensive, so I do buy them for my dogs, but then I don't keep buying them every 6 weeks. I just retreat them with permethrin myself. Your dogs can also get a pill once a month. We use one for that. If a tick bites the dog, it actually kills them, which is kind of makes you worry about like what's going into your dog, but it works. I find dead ticks on my dogs all the time. And if you see a bullseye rash, go to the doctor. The doctor doesn't need to test you if they see a bullseye rash. They'll give you antibiotics right then. And a bullseye rash tells you this is early stage disease, so it will get cured with antibiotics. And above all, if you get traveling joint pain, that's the pain that moves from joint to joint to joint, get tested. And I don't mean just like, oh, my left knee's been hurting me for 3 months. Is that Lyme disease? No, probably not. If it's just if it's just one joint and it's been hurting for a long time, fairly consistently, that's probably not Lyme disease. It's probably you hurt yourself. But if it's going from one joint to another, and it's not just like, does it hurt or not? If it's like, no, this really hurts, and it's going from one joint to another, that's probably Lyme disease. So get tested. Don't do it just once. Get tested 3 or even 4 times, waiting 3 or 4 weeks in between tests. And if your doctor disagrees with that, maybe seek a second opinion. Even maybe seek a Lyme literate doctor, but be careful that you don't get over-treated or treated for Lyme when you have something else.
The Outdoor Life podcast is edited and produced by Senior Deputy Editor Natalie Krebs. It's hosted by me, Editor-in-Chief Alex Robinson. Reporting in this episode is by Tom Gerencer, who is a writer and editor for Science, Tech, Business, and the Outdoors. He's a regular contributor to HP Tech Takes and Boys Life. His book, Think Like Google, Build SEO with Empathy, is now available on Amazon.